This is a place for you to share and gain insight on how to succeed and better serve more families in this rapidly changing marketplace. This is FDTV.
Hello and welcome to another episode of FDTV. Today we will visit with Todd Carlson, Executive Vice President of Sales and Chief Sales Officer here at Funeral Directors Life, in part one of a two-part series called The Empathy Paradox. Now in today's episode, Todd discusses one of the biggest ironies in the funeral profession, as well as his thoughts on how these might be overcome. Todd, I recently came across an article that you've been working on. I know that we periodically visit from time to time talking about the changing funeral consumer and how the environment's changed over the years. But tell me a little bit about how just the entire funeral service landscape has changed.
Well, I can give you my perspective from my personal experience over these past 30 years, and I've seen some tremendous changes. And when I was arranging funerals as a young intern in rural Minnesota back in the late 80s and early 90s, one thing I saw some signs or some harbingers of things to come. For example, I'd be meeting with a family to plan their father or their mother's funeral, and we would be standing in the selection room, and they would be looking at caskets and vaults, and the kids would often say, well, this is good for mom and dad, but when we go and it's our time, we're not going to put that kind of money into the ground. We're thinking about being cremated. And those were the early signs as a young funeral director that I saw that things would be changing. And this is back in the day in that county where I practiced funeral service. We had 0 cremations at that time. So when you have family after family saying throughout the arrangement, throughout the year, that they were thinking about doing things differently for themselves, I knew that things would begin to change at some point. And now, just fast forward 30 years, I think that we're at that tipping point where the snowball is building and the change is occurring. And I think funeral service professionals are really trying to figure out how to reinvent themselves to change this the new funeral consumer.
I know that in the article that I was looking through, you kind of discussed empathy and the role that empathy plays as a funeral director. Let's go into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think funeral service is one of the greatest professions in the world. I think the people that this profession draws are phenomenal people. And I've in my 30 years of meeting funeral directors across the country, I see that every day. And funeral directors are some of the most empathetic people I've ever seen in my life. And what's interesting, though, is I'm seeing this extremely empathetic group of people struggling with how to adapt to change. And, so I think that's one of the biggest challenges in the profession today is what do we do about some of these trends that we're seeing in funeral service, and how do I actually change the way I interact with a family in an arrangement conference or in a digital world.
What's interesting to note is Dr. Alan Wolfelt often kind of refers to what essentially is today's funeral consumer is a death-free society who hasn't experienced much loss. What role does that play in the funeral director's empathy?
Oh, I think what Dr. Wolfelt has identified, and I agree with wholeheartedly, is that this death-free generation, people are so healthy and living so long that we're bumping into people in their 50s and 60s as far as their age goes that have never arranged a funeral. And we don't attend funerals like we used to. And so there's really become this lost understanding of why a funeral is so important. And what is and why do we have visitation? Why do we have other elements of ceremony? So people, when they come in, they're coming in asking for something differently. And I think the funeral director is a little bit right now behind that curve, and that is creating quite a paradox, because you have this most empathetic group of people in the most empathetic profession failing in some cases, in many cases, to look at this new experience that families are experiencing from the family's point of view. And then saying, how do I adjust my goods, my services, my facilities, my behavior in the arrangement conference, the way I talk and interact with families, analog and digitally, how do I change to adapt to those needs? Which is, the irony is the fundamental purpose of empathy, is to see something from someone else's perspective.
I mean, I know that families don't always know what they need when they come in. So,
Absolutely.
A family doesn't come in and say, hey, I need this, and the funeral director is failing to meet those needs. There's not a connection being made. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think so. I think what we've got is this system to serve families that was built over time and it might be 2 or 3 generations old, this process, the system, and we've aligned our facilities and our practices to serve a certain kind of family. That family, was a religious family on the average. They viewed the expression of their funeral desires more in a uniform mode. Guests were spectators and not participants in the funeral process. And it really met the needs of local family and friends. Over the last 30 years, we've become so much more spread out as family than we used to be. I take my own family, for example. My mother lives in northern Minnesota. I have 2 brothers, 5 and 6 hours away, southern Minnesota. I live in Texas. My sister lives in Nevada. And, so when my dad died, several years ago, that the challenge of how do we serve a family that doesn't live in the community anymore, is one of those key things. So what we're facing today is a family who doesn't have a religious structure to fall back on to create the process for how to move forward with ceremony in the remembrance process. They also are viewing the funeral service, like in other events, much more casually than in the past, or informally. And it's they want to be involved in so many aspects of writing the obituary to printing goods and services, uploading videos, or even doing the memorial video themselves in other areas. And they're coming from all over the country. And frankly, families want to be more digitally plugged in. They want to be able to work at home and they're shopping, buying online, and they want to carry those behaviors into the funeral service experience also. So what we've got is this new generation that, by the way, those and often called baby boomers, who are the leading edge of the baby boom now is 73, 74 years old, and they're carrying their ideas about how to interact with business and with each other into the funeral home. But the systems that many funeral homes are running are geared to serve the previous generation. And that's the rub. And that creates cognitive dissonance for both families and funeral directors. So the family comes in asking themselves, you know what, I don't feel like the funeral director is kind of seeing it my way, that empathy paradox, right? And so they will choose to opt out of the system. And on the other hand, the funeral director is saying, I'm working my tail off trying to serve this family, but I don't understand how I need to serve that family in this new world. And that creates the dissonance in their world. And what we need to do is to make sure that loyalty stays into our profession, because I hear that as a repeated problem. Families aren't as loyal as they used to be. Mm-hmm. And I have to remind funeral directors, it's not family's job to be loyal, it's our job to be loyal to them by giving them providing the things that we know they need, and even the things they don't even know they need. So we've got to resolve this paradox by becoming empathetic, viewing this process from the current eyes viewpoint of families, and then changing our services and our interaction, our language to meet the needs of today's family.
So Todd, tell us, how do funeral directors start putting that empathy to work for them?
That's a good question, Rob. And as you know, we host a lot of funeral director groups here at the home office, and when they come into our facility here and begin to meet our people, one of the things that we ask them is to ask them what kind of challenges they're facing in funeral service and what kind of issues they're having. And what we often hear is things like, we're having a hard time recruiting good talent. We're having a hard time connecting with families today, and we're we're having a problem with families aren't as loyal as they used to be. 5 years ago, we would say, but things are changing. You're really serving a new funeral consumer, and what we would often hear is, not in my town. That hasn't hit me. That's we'd have to talk about change. What's different today is when those guests come in and we say, talk about some business challenges you're having. The idea that they see change hitting them in the face every day. And many times some of our guests will come in thinking thoughts like, I don't know if I can handle this. I don't know what to do about these changes. There's not good training out there, or I don't know about good training out there to help me resolve these issues in my business. But what they're not arguing anymore is that things have changed. Mm-hmm. That is crystal clear in the minds of almost every funeral professional I talk to now is change. So then the question becomes, then how do we change, right? How do we build that bridge from what we're currently doing to a new way of serving families? And I think step one to understanding change is really to ask ourselves the question is, let's use that empathy, that gift that funeral service has, its biggest strength, and say, let's look at families from their current point of view. And then we can think about how to make adjustments, but we don't often slow down enough to say, let's take a fresh look. Mm-hmm. Let's look at what families are really trying to accomplish today, and what are their circumstances today, and then how do we serve that family? I'll give you an example. We talked about the fact that we're serving a death-free generation. So we have to understand that families are coming to this process, as Dr. Wolfelt describes, as naked to the experience. They don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what they should do, why they should do what they need to do, or how a funeral ceremony that's meaningful and healing to them, how it can be created, and the benefits that they will receive by doing by holding a healing and meaningful tribute for their loved one. We have to understand, this is a purchase, Rob, that no one wants to make. Yeah. So we have to understand that basic foundation. No one wants to make this purchase, and it's an infrequent purchase. I mean, how many funerals do you think? It's a rhetorical question. Right. Let me say it this way: the average person probably arranges when they come to the funeral home, it's their first funeral arrangement experience, and if maybe their second, and rarely their third. And so you think about this: if you're going to buy a car for the first time, I remember I bought my first car. It was a Ford Taurus, and looking back, no, I got screwed on that deal, because I was an inexperienced car buyer. Mm-hmm. I've compared notes with other friends of mine who have bought cars for the first time. They all relay a similar experience as that first negotiation, because they were inexperienced and unfamiliar with the process. When they were young, they just didn't get a good deal. Some people say that on their first house they signed, or the first apartment lease they ever did. Inexperience will cause families to not know what to do in this time of grief. And I think the other thing we have to understand in today's world, with the internet being such a part of our life, and the smartphone being such a powerful part of our life, is there's so much information out there that we in funeral service forget that for the family, the arrangement conference starts way before we think it does. When the death occurs, or even before the death occurs, these family members are online, and they're learning because they're a death-free generation, because it's an infrequent purchase they really don't want to make. They haven't spent a lot of their life thinking about what would happen if mom died. It's a thought they're trying to avoid. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is they're online and they're searching, and so that lays the foundation for the what do we do about it.
How do we take the understanding of the family's perception and incorporate that into the change?
That's really the next step then, is we need to think about this. We've thought about it from the family's point of view. We've identified some key issues, the dispersed family, all those things we talked about, how families have changed in their current situation. And then we have to look at it for what are the needs that this family has. And there are two kinds of needs: the needs they tell us they have, and the needs they don't know they have. Okay, so let me describe. I'll tell you a little story which will illustrate the difference. Mm-hmm. If I'm walking down the sidewalk and I step in a little puddle of water and my sock gets wet because I've got a hole in my shoe, I realize I need a new pair of shoes. So that's a realized need. Now, the other situation might be if I get dressed in the morning and I put on my suit and I've got I put my shoes on and my belt on, and just as I'm ready to walk out the door, my wife looks at me and says, "Are you really going to wear those shoes with that belt?" I stop and I go, because of that question, I go, "Wait, what do you mean?" "Well, your shoes and your belt don't match. Are you really going to go out that way?" So now I realize I've converted that unrealized need. I didn't know that my shoes and my belt didn't match. My wife has implanted that thought into my mind by asking me a simple question: "Are you sure you want to do that?" And now I need to go buy a new pair of shoes. Mm-hmm. So she took an unrealized need, converted it to a realized need, and now there's something I can act on as a consumer. So that next step is to think about those needs that families have and the needs that they don't know they have. And then we can apply our so what families are really looking for in this process, Rob, is a guide. Mm. They're looking for help. They don't know that they're looking for help, but they call a funeral home and they think they have it figured out because they've been online, right? And researching this, how to plan a funeral. And so they come in many times thinking they know how to do this. And so the funeral director's response is to say, "Well, I'd like to, what do you need or what do you want?" And that's the starting point. And but the challenge is, because it's an infrequent purchase no one wants to make, and it's the families don't even know what they don't know. and we're left to serve that family.
That's a common theme that we talk about on this program, is they don't know what they don't know, and then asking them what they want that's a dead-end question.
It is, and here's the strange thing: we are so trained in funeral service to do what families want, and that we view that as the highest level of service that we can offer a family is doing what they want. And I think as we move forward and we identify how we need to update our facilities, change our language, improve our technology, and really meet today's funeral consumer where they're at, is we have to also change our thinking about that very subject. It's not about, because think of it this way: I need knee surgery. I tore my meniscus playing basketball a year ago, and I've been delaying surgery. When I sit down with my knee surgeon's not going to say, "So Todd, how would you like me to handle your knee surgery?" In a professional context, the professional asking that question, it almost seems laughable. So you chuckled,
Yeah.
and it is funny. Or hey Rob, you go in to get your car repaired, and the mechanic looks at you and says, "Well, Rob, we got some problems with your car. How would you like your car repaired?" It's almost an absurd question in any other context, but in funeral services, like, we wear that with a badge of honor. Well, we're doing what the family wants. The problem is families don't know what they want, and they know less about what they truly need in order to grieve their loved one in a way that's going to put them on a path to a healthy grieving experience. So what we have to do is replace that language with, "What do you need?" And instead we should be asking, "Tell me about your loved one," so we can work together to create a tribute that would honor their life and serve your family well. And that changes that discussion. So "tell me what you want" should be words that no funeral director ever uses again, and that would make that would be one of the better things we could do in funeral service.
As Todd said, our empathy and our ability to see something from someone else's perspective can actually be used to inform our ability to adapt to families' needs. Because we know that, one, funeral directors are some of the most empathetic people around, and many of them are just having trouble adjusting to the new funeral consumer. But we in the funeral profession need to use our greatest strength, which is empathy, to see the funeral planning experience from the family's point of view. And we also need to become a guide to that family and help them to create an experience that is healing and meaningful. And finally, understanding that the real paradox is that we might think that giving families what they want is the highest level of service, when in fact, they would actually be better served if we can just begin to ask ourselves, what does this family really need? Thanks for watching. I really look forward to hearing some feedback from you on this, and be on the lookout for part 2 of this session with Todd Carlson next time on FDTV.